The sun had just risen over the gentle hills of Pennsylvania. It was an ordinary morning, warm, lazy, like so many others. The birds were still testing their first songs, and the breeze gently brushed against the porch curtains. Joe and Altsman's house was waking slowly, as if in no hurry to start the day. Inside, the kitchen clock showed just after 9 a.m. Joanne was alone. Not unusual. She'd lived there for years. A widow. Independent. White hair, steady steps, though her body had started to show that time was moving more harshly than before. That day, everything felt calm. She had agreed to look after her daughter's pig for a few days. Lulu. A large, curious, and absurdly quiet creature. She was out in the yard, snuffling through the dirt as she always did. Joanne was making coffee. She skimmed the newspaper. Glanced at the obituaries, a long-standing habit. Smirked to herself, satisfied that her name still wasn't there. And then, everything stopped. It was like a glitch in the air. A breath caught midway. Her right hand flew to her chest. The warmth from the stove gave way to a sudden cold creeping up her back, tightening her breath. Her fingers trembled. The edges of her vision darkened. Joanne collapsed. Right there, in the kitchen. Alone. The sound of her body hitting the floor was muffled by the kettle beginning to whistle. And the world kept going. Just a few yards away, in the backyard, Lulu lifted her head. Stopped rooting through the dirt. Something had changed. She didn't know what. But she felt it. And in that moment, the question was no longer just hypothetical. What if the only chance of survival was outside, on four legs, with a snout full of dirt? Joanne was a woman of ritual. She woke before sunrise, brewed her coffee slowly, watered the plants on the windowsill, and wrote in a notebook the small happenings of the previous day. It wasn't loneliness, it was chosen silence. And yet, the rooms had felt too big ever since her husband passed, a few years back. The TV only came on in the evenings. The phone rang rarely. And the memories, they showed up uninvited. It was on one of those slow mornings that her daughter dropped off Lulu. A large pig, round-bodied and dark-eyed, who always seemed to carry a question in her gaze. Lulu didn't make much noise. She didn't ask for much. But there was something about her, hard to ignore. Yes, she was gentle, but also stubborn, as if she understood more than one would expect from an animal. She was already known to the family. An unlikely sort of pet, who ate cookies with the kids, laid on rugs like a dog, and could somehow, almost eerily, recognize the sound of her daughter's car from all the others. Joanne had never been particularly affectionate with animals. She never needed to be. But Lulu didn't require affection to exist. Just space. And time. During her stay, Lulu settled into her own rhythm. She rooted through the yard early in the morning. Then lay under the cherry tree, not sleeping, just watching. In the afternoon, she'd slowly walk to the porch and sit for long minutes, staring at the front door as if waiting for something to happen. Joanne would notice from a distance. That behavior. It was strange. But also, comforting. As if she wasn't truly alone. They didn't exchange affection. But they exchanged presence. And as the days passed, something quiet began to grow between them. Not friendship. But a kind of harmony. As subtle as the sound a kettle makes just before it boils. The morning began like so many others. Joanne woke before the alarm. Light filtered through the curtains, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. She rose slowly, her knees protesting, her bones quietly reminding her that youth had left with the winters long gone. The kettle went on the stove. The newspaper was already folded on the table. She opened it with careful fingers, as if handling something fragile, or sacred. She read slowly, absorbing distant headlines, columns on politics, and a small note about a flower exhibition in a neighboring town. But it was the obituary page that made her stop. She read it every day. The names. The dates. Looking for familiar faces, old neighbors, any sign that time passed for others too. That morning, she didn't recognize a single name. Still, she lingered, staring at the page as if it said more than it actually did. Outside, Lulu gently pawed the soil beneath the cherry tree. Her snout moved slowly. Her eyes locked on the kitchen door, as if counting the minutes. Joanne poured herself a cup of coffee. The aroma was strong, but it no longer comforted her the way it used to. There was a strange weight in the air. Lately, she'd been feeling pressure in her chest. A light tightness that came and went. She blamed age. Fatigue. She was never one for doctors. Never had been. She walked over to the sink. Washed a cup. And in that moment, everything changed. A sharp pain shot through her left arm. Her chest tightened, as if the world itself had pushed down on her. Her legs gave out before she even realized she was falling. The glass slipped and shattered on the floor. Joanne tried to reach for the counter, but her body didn't respond. The phone was just a few steps away, but it might as well have been miles. Her vision blurred. The sound of blood filled her ears. Everything else was drowned out. Then, the floor. Silence. Outside, Lulu stopped rooting. She lifted her head. Her ears twitched with instinctual precision. She grunted softly. Walked to the porch. Stopped in front of the closed door. She sniffed. Took 2 steps to the side. Came back. She began to pace in circles, restless. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She let out short, urgent grunts, sharper than usual. She stomped her hoof on the ground, sniffed at the crack beneath the door, and began circling again. With each lap, her movements quickened, almost desperate. Inside, Joanne lay motionless. Eyes half closed. Breathing shallow. Time was passing. And with it, her chance of survival. But outside, something refused to accept the end. Something that couldn't speak, but felt everything. And in that moment, what was once just instinct, began to become salvation. Lulu hadn't seen Joanne since early that morning. The kitchen door was still closed. The sound of the kettle had stopped, and now the silence was different. A silence that felt heavy. Paralyzing. She moved toward the side of the house, where the old doggy door was. It was small. Far too small for her body. But something inside her insisted. Called. With her snout, she nudged the plastic flap. She felt it give, but also resist. She tried once. Pulled back. Then, with force, threw her body forward. The sound of the scrape was harsh. Plastic scraped against her skin. The metal frame struck her left flank. She scratched herself. She bled. But she got in. Inside, the scent was strange. The smell of fear. Of urgency. She spotted Joanne on the kitchen floor. Motionless. Lulu approached slowly. Sniffed her face. Grunted softly. She circled the body. Pressed her snout to Joanne's shoulder, as if trying to call her back. Nothing. Lulu stood still for a few seconds. Staring. Breathing heavily. And then, she turned. Back to the doggy door. Now she had to get out. Even harder. Her body ached. Her wound stung. But she didn't hesitate. She pushed. Forced her shoulders through. The plastic cut into her skin again. The frame gave with a crack, and she tumbled outside, legs shaky, but standing. The street in front of the house was nearly empty. The sky, now covered in heavy clouds, seemed to hold its breath. And then, Lulu ran. At first stumbling. Then stronger. She crossed the yard, ran down the small slope toward the road, and stopped right in the middle of the asphalt. There. Right in the center of the lane. Cars were approaching in the distance. None seemed to notice. She grunted. Softly at first. Then louder. And then, she did the unthinkable. She lay down. On the asphalt. In the middle of the road. Like a living barricade. Like a scream without a voice. The wind tugged at her ears. The heat of the road burned her wounded skin. But she didn't move. Not until someone stopped. The car had screeched to a sudden stop. The man, dazed, stepped out unsteadily, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was a pig, a real pig, in the middle of the road. But what struck him most wasn't her size, it was her eyes. That creature looked at him as if she had something urgent to say. She turned. Took a few steps. Stopped. Turned again. Looked over her shoulder. As if she were calling. The man hesitated, but instinct took over. He followed. Lulu walked slowly, limping slightly. Her left flank was bleeding. Every movement seemed to hurt, but she didn't stop. She crossed the yard, rounded the garden, and stopped in front of the back door. There. She lay down. Exhausted. But alert. The man stepped up to the door, peeked through the small side window, and then, he saw. On the kitchen floor, a woman lay collapsed. Motionless. Her hand stretched out, as if she'd tried to grab something. The kettle was tipped over. A trail of dried coffee marked the floor. He rammed the door with his shoulder. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the house like thunder. He ran to Joanne. Felt her pulse. Her skin was cold. But, there was a heartbeat. Faint, but there. His heart raced. His mind locked into focus. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his phone. Dialed. The call connected to emergency services. The operator's voice sounded distant, like it came from underwater. But he managed. The words came out scattered: address. Approximate age. Critical condition. Outside, Lulu didn't move. She just waited. Minutes later, minutes that felt like hours, the sound of the ambulance tore through the stillness of the countryside. Red lights reflected in the windows of the house like a silent alarm sent to the universe. Paramedics jumped out running. Equipment, low voices, swift movements. And in the middle of the commotion, one of them stopped. He looked at the pig lying in front of the door, wounded, but steady. And he understood. Joanne was carried out carefully. Oxygen mask, monitored pulse, compresses on her chest. And just before the ambulance doors closed, Lulu stepped closer. Pressed her snout against the edge of the stretcher, unhurried. As if she needed to say goodbye. Or maybe, to say, she's here. Now do the rest. That day, Joanne Altsman's life was saved. But not by some random miracle. She was saved, because someone decided to act. And that someone had hooves. And a name, Lulu. The days that followed were wrapped in silence, a different kind of silence than the one that used to fill the house. This was a silence of waiting. Joanne spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The diagnosis was clear: a heart attack. And the prognosis, uncertain. The doctor was blunt: 2 or 3 more minutes, and she might not have made it. Help had arrived just in time. A breath of time between the end and what remained. She didn't remember the exact moment she fell. Only a sensation, that someone had come. Outside, Lulu stayed at the daughter's house. She refused food on the first day. Paced the yard in circles, as if waiting to see that familiar figure step out onto the porch. Her eyes were darker. Her snout, less curious. But there was calm in her. Like someone who knows that everything is now where it should be, being cared for. At the hospital, Joanne returned slowly. First her gaze. Then the touch in her hands. Later, the hesitant steps down the hallways. By the third week, sitting on the edge of her bed, she held in her hands a small wooden box her daughter had brought. Inside, a few personal things, an old handkerchief, a photo of her late husband, and a printed image of Lulu, lying in the road, asphalt beneath her body, eyes turned toward the lens of some stranger's phone. Joanne ran her fingers over the photo. Closed her eyes. And for the first time in a long while, she cried. Not from pain. But from gratitude. The reunion happened on a gray afternoon, at the gate of her home, finally discharged. Lulu was lying beneath the tree, just like she used to on quiet mornings. When she heard the gate open, she stood. Her steps were slow, still marked by the injuries of her escape. But there was steadiness. And recognition. Joanne stepped out of the car with difficulty. Her daughter stood beside her, supporting her arm. But she didn't look at anyone. Only at Lulu. And Lulu, only at her. Neither of them moved at first. The world around them felt far away. It was as if something invisible between them was being rebuilt in that very moment. Then Joanne opened her arms. And Lulu stepped forward. Gently. With reverence. Her snout touched the fabric of Joanne's coat. Joanne bowed her head, rested her forehead on the pig's forehead. And there they stayed. Quiet. Whole. No words. None needed. Because in that small gesture there was everything that needed to be said. And the world could simply watch from a distance. The days passed like leaves carried by the wind, gentle, but full of meaning. Joanne returned home with shorter steps, a little slower, but with a new light in her eyes. There was no rush. No fear. Only time, and the chance to live it once more. Her daughter, moved by everything that had happened, made a quiet decision. Lulu would not return with her. That house, that yard, and that woman, now belonged to Lulu too. She would stay. Not as a guest. But as a guardian. And Lulu seemed to know. She followed Joanne discreetly, like a protective shadow. She lay beside her chair on the porch. She walked slowly through the garden, as if recognizing each flower, every corner of the house where life had been preserved. Their routine was simple. Light coffee in the morning. A walk through the yard at dusk. The newspaper, which Joanne now read aloud in a soft voice, even if no one answered. The house was quieter, but it wasn't the silence from before. It was a silence that was full. Alive. Each new day, Joanne rediscovered small things once forgotten, the smell of cold mornings, the taste of buttered bread, the texture of the breeze brushing her face. And Lulu was there. Watching. Caring. There was no need to repeat what had happened. Neither of them needed to. What existed now was enough, shared time. A life rebuilt. A presence that didn't need words to say, I'm here. And so, the house that had almost become an ending, became a beginning once again.
What did you think of this story? If you liked it, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.